Hello, welcome to Chapter 8, Analysis of a Tariff. A tariff is a tax on importing a good or service into a country. There are several different types of tariffs. Specific tariff is a dollar amount that's added to the price of the imported good. An ad valorem tariff is like a sales tax. In other words, it's a percentage of the price that's added on to the estimated market value of the imported good. And a compound tariff is a combination of the specific and the ad valorem. A little preview of the conclusions. Generally, economists do not like taxes because they feel that taxes distort decision making and also lead to a welfare loss. A tariff is a form of a tax, so economists feel exactly the same way about tariffs. The tariff lowers the well-being of the world, even though the distribution of that well-being could result, for instance, in the country that imposes the tariffs actually benefiting from the imposition of those tariffs. If we have that situation, we have the exception, which is the nationally optimal tariff. And that's when a nation can affect the prices at which it trades with foreigners so it can gain from the tariff. That's an exception. It's not really seen very often, and we're going to talk about the conditions when that occurs. For the most part, though, when a country imposes a tariff, both the importing country and the exporting country lose, and we're going to see why that's the case. The tariff also does help those in the domestic industry that produces that same good that's being imported. So let's start off with an example. This is the effect of a tariff on domestic producers. So we've got the US market for bicycles. So here, if we have no trade, so in autarky we'd be at the intersection of supply and demand, which looks as though it would cause us to have a price of around 400 and be selling roughly looks like around 1.1 million bikes. Now, when we go into free trade, the world price matters. So if the world price was 300 in this diagram, then actually our domestic producers would produce up to point B. That is, they produce 0.6 million bikes, and the rest will be filled by imports. So that's the distance between B and E, which turns out to be 1 million, giving us a total demand of 1.6 million. What's the producer surplus and the consumer surplus? Well, the producer surplus of domestic firms would be that triangle ABC, and the domestic consumer surplus would be the triangle CEF, or FEC, he's written it as. So what happens when we have a tariff? Well, first of all, we've got to make an assumption about the country imposing the tariffs in terms of their ability to affect the world price. So let's assume that any tariff that's imposed by this country will not affect the market for bikes overall, the world market for bikes. So if the world price starts off at 300, the point is here that after the tariff is imposed by this country, whichever country it is, say the US, the world price will still be 300. In other words, the fact that the US raises tariffs as a form of a tax will not affect production and prices elsewhere in the world. So let's do that. Let's have the tariff going up, and here we've got a tariff of 10%, so we end up at a price of 330. So it's the domestic price with the tariff, and you can see that blue arrow points to the price being increased. So what happens to domestic producers producer surplus, well, it goes from G to A plus G. So you can see that they have benefited. Also, you can see that with the tariff, the amount of imports has fallen. It was S0, D0, and it's now kind of being pinched both ends. So it's S1, D1 now. And you can see that below in those blue bracketed distances. So we start off with M0 being the amount of imports, and then we move to M1 being the new amount of imports when the tariff is imposed. So what happens in terms of consumers? So looked at producers. In terms of consumers, the price goes up. Well, they were at point E with FEC as the consumer surplus. You can see that as the tariff goes up, the consumer surplus shrinks to FGH. That means that domestic consumers lose consumer surplus of A plus B plus C plus D. So let's go back to the producers. So far, the tariff has increased the producer surplus by A, and it's reduced consumer surplus by A plus B plus C plus D. Now, what about the government's position here? Well, the tariff is like a tax, so it's going to bring revenue to the country's government. And the revenue that's going to be derived from the tariff is going to be the amount of the tax that's charged on the goods that are imported after the tariff has been imposed. So if we go back to this diagram here, that will be the triangle, or the rectangle, sorry, C, little c. So let's go over this. We've had producers gaining A, we've had consumers losing A plus B plus C plus D, and we've had the government gaining C as tariff revenue. So if we add those all up, we get that the US would lose, and it would lose those triangles B plus D. And a lot of people call those little triangles deadweight loss because they are areas that aren't reallocated to anyone. They're just lost completely. Some people call them consumption inefficiencies, and some people call them production inefficiencies as well, for the move up the supply curve and up the demand curve when the tariff is imposed. Of course, that revenue that goes to the government could be used to benefit citizens by building of new schools, building of, hospitals, whatever. So the net national loss is going to be B plus D. So how do we account for those in terms of welfare? Well, as I said, one is kind of consumption inefficiency, or equals a consumption effect. It shows the loss to the consumers in the importing nation based on the reduction in their total consumption. And there's a production effect. It's the amount by which the cost of drawing domestic resources away from other uses exceeds the savings from not paying foreigners to buy extra units. Here we have the situation where we're looking at the US market for bicycles, which we talked about, the effect on the market for US bicycle imports. So what we do is take the diagram we just looked at, which is on the left as in panel A, and we put that together with a market for imports, which we know has shrunk, and it's shrunk from the distance between 1.6 and 0.6, which is 1, to the new distance between 1.4 and 0.8, which is 0.6. So on the right-hand side, you can see we've moved from 1, and we've gone up the demand curve to the higher price with the tariff of $330, and then basically that drops our imports to 0.6. We draw those, draw a line through those 2 points, and that gets us that demand curve for imports in that right-hand panel. And I'm going to stop there so that we have a part 2.